And I'm going to invite Dr. Kerry Hall to turn on their microphone and their camera as they're our second presenter for today. So Dr. Kerry is a proud descendant of the Kuku Thaypan, Kuku Warra and Lama people of Cape York Peninsula. Her work aims to address access, engagement and inequity issues specific to First Nation people through collaboration, prioritising community voices and perspectives. So I welcome Kerry to turn on their camera if they haven't done so already and provide a visual description of yourself, if that's okay. I just can't find you on my screen. There you are.
I am here.
Okay, I've got you. I'm going to spotlight you. Thank you, Kerry.
Thanks,
Over
Ella.
to you.
Hi, everybody. I've got shoulder-length bobbed hair that's going grey, and I have today on a black T-shirt and wire-rimmed glasses. I'll just share my screen. Can you see that, everybody?
Yes, that is perfect. Thank you.
Okay. That's not model. There we go. So today I'm going to talk about Indigenous ways of learning in sport and how it can help in sport and creating culturally safe spaces and First Peoples perspectives applied to sport. Lessons learned from a project I was involved in a couple of years ago, Rekindle Culture, Inclusivity and Play, and how to hopefully change and evolve culture in sport and individual cultures and how they align. So, thank you. What's going on with my slides? My slides are being difficult. There we go. Sorry. I would like to acknowledge the the Kabi Kabi people whose lands I'm presenting on today, and just acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be listening to this presentation. As Alice said, I'm a nurse, I'm an Aboriginal health practitioner, and my role at Griffith is learning and teaching in the Indigenous space. So the first thing we're going to talk about today, which is some of the work I do every day, it's about Indigenous ways of learning and Indigenous methods of learning that can be applied across many different contexts and not just in education, but in sport as well. And some of the projects I've done at Griffith that Kelly's aware of, and that I've done with Claire Minahan, is around using yarning circles and these Indigenous ways of learning to collect data on some research projects. So the first thing we're going to talk about is yarning circles. Yarning circles are Indigenous ways from around the world that have been used for thousands of years to highlight the emphasis and importance of storytelling and knowledge sharing through stories. It goes beyond a conversation and can take different shapes as social yarning. That's the yarning you do before a topic when you're just getting to know each other and build trust and rapport and establish a connection. So much work that you do in the Indigenous space is about building relationships, not transactions. And if you can build relationships and not transactions, you'll have much more success in what you're trying to develop. The second is the research topic. If it's around research, it's relaxed. It's still a relaxed conversation, but it's purposeful to gather information related to the research topic or the ideas around the research topic. And then we have collaborative yarning, which is about sharing information, exploring ideas and explaining new topics that leading to new understandings. And therapeutic yarning is probably the one where people sometimes have fear of, because it's when the participant or people in the yarning circle disclose information that is particularly traumatic, intensely personal and emotional. And it's when other people in the circle or the researcher, if you're researching in space, becomes the listener. And it's just about sitting there and listening and not necessarily offering an opinion, but letting the people have the safety of the circle to share their story. And I think that's really important in many facets of what we do every day. But if we're talking about disability or inequities, yarning circles are a really good way to build relationships, because we're sitting in a circle, there's no barriers in front of us, and everyone has the equal right to have a voice and have a say. The next one is Ganma. which is a term from the Yolngu people of the Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory. And it describes a genuine two-way knowledge sharing experience. It's derived from where a lagoon saltwater meets freshwater and describes what happens when the two different waters meet and mix to create something new. In Yolngu philosophy, water is a symbol of knowledge, and a metaphor of two bodies of water meeting is a way of talking about knowledge systems of two cultures working together. It allows new knowledge to be created for understanding by working respectfully together and taking time to listen and to see what is revealed. Importantly, when working together and new knowledge is created, the old knowledge is not forgotten. It becomes memory, allowing people from different cultures to share deeply without losing their histories and integrity in that space. And Diti, this one is important. A lot of people struggle struggle with this method, Indigenous method of data collection or embracing this Indigenous method of learning. And it's about sitting in silence. It's in a deep listening and quiet still awareness. So we're sitting in silence, and quite often in this space that we work in this westernized world that we work and live in, sitting in silence is sometimes seen as not being valuable. But when you're working with Indigenous communities or Indigenous spaces, sitting in silence is one of probably the most important skills to develop. And it does take a long time to develop, and it takes a lot of work for non-Indigenous researchers or people in this space to be able to develop that ability to sit in silence and just be. So from the rekindle culture work that we did a couple of years ago for the Inclusivity in Play at Griffith, the team I was involved in was looking at making sporting organisations culturally safe and barrier-free for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples with a disability. And some of the things that we came up with was culturally safe spaces, barrier-free spaces, and making those spaces enjoyable. We spoke to many organisations, Tennis Australia, Bangarra Dance Company. We spoke to institutions or sporting institutions and other institutions that are working with Indigenous spaces to find out what they were doing and why they were successful in the space. And some of the points we got back from that was we need to co-design and have leadership and mentoring with communities, and particularly with young people, to be the change agents in communities. Upskill people on the barriers and strategies for inclusion to sport for people with a disability. Provide a strong voice for decision-making and ability to implement change. And develop recruitment and retention strategies that encourages people with disability to be involved in community sport. Well, not just being involved as a participant, but also being involved in community sport or in sport as part of the leadership of the organisation to better embed what works for people with a disability in sport. And so it's not these tacked on ideas and scenarios that may work, may not work, and then can be changed. We need to embed things in so that people with disability can be involved in sport in a safe way. And support and advocacy and the athlete's voice. So this is a lot of the work that I do at Griffith. So we always talk about sporting culture and culture in sport, and we all have culture that we live our life by, but they quite often don't align and don't meet in the middle where to make a safe space where people's voices can be heard. And quite often athletes aren't heard by sporting organisations, and it touched on what Georgia said before, there's no space for you here or whatever it is. And I think a lot of what needs to happen is that sporting organisations need to change their culture and be aware of their culture and whether their culture is safe for athletes of diverse backgrounds, diversities and disabilities to be involved in their communities, in their sporting communities. Because quite often athletes' identities and cultures become erased by the sport or the organisations that they can be part of. So it's really important that individual athletes' culture is paramount and is protected when they're in sport. Otherwise, people will walk away from sport or quite often in sporting organisations, and some of the work I've done with different groups is there are able-bodied coaches, coaching disabled athletes, and they have really no understanding or idea because they're an able-bodied person. So it's getting more people with disabilities into sporting organisations, into those sorts of roles, so that people can align with the values of their coach and the culture of their coach, or whoever that may be. In the work I do every day in the Indigenous space in education, we have this statement, you can't be what you can't see. And I think that aligns with sport. If young up-and-coming athletes with disability can't see themselves in sporting organisations as being valued, why would they want to go there? That's the end of my presentation. Stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Kerry. That was very insightful. I definitely learned a lot, and I love the deep listening and the being quiet. I think that is something that everybody needs to sit in that uncomfortable space, because that's when we learn more and we grow and we understand. And the empathy, I think, really is developed in that uncomfort.
It sure is, Ella. That's a really good point. You need to be lean into the uncomfortable in these spaces to be able to learn and grow and bring people along. If you're willing to lean into that uncomfortable space with your athletes or people with a disability, they will see that you have an empathy and an understanding. And it goes from empathy to sympathy. Sympathy is so final. I'm sorry. Let's just all move on. Whereas empathy, you have some sort of understanding of what's happening in that space. But yeah. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you so much, Kerry. Hang around, though, and if we have any questions, please pop them in the chat and we'll get to them after our next presentation. So I'm going to now ask Dr. Diti Bhattachyarya to turn on their camera and unmute your microphone. So our third presenter for the day is Dr. Diti Bhattachyarya. Diti's research relates to how sporting practices and fitness cultures can be used as a social conduit through which marginalised communities experience a sense of belonging and community. Her current expertise in sporting geographies and social inclusion is being applied to her postdoctorate research fellow role working on an ARC discovery project titled Engaging Outsiders in Sport, Transforming Major Sporting Event Legacies, planned through a co-creation approach. So Diti, I'm already spotlight. I'm going to unspotlight Kerry. Thank you for that. Did you want to share your screen? I've got a few questions to ask you as well as we move through your presentation.
Yeah.
Oh, that's me. That's terrifying.
Can you see the slides now?
Yes, we can see your slides. Thank you so much for that. So my first question, or I guess welcome and thank you for presenting today. And my first question to you is to start, could you please discuss the cultural representation often expected of elite athletes and how these complex negotiations play out in an athlete's professional career?
So first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity of being able to present in today's symposium. My name is Diti Bhattachyarya, and I'm wearing a grey colored top, and I have glasses on, and I've got curly hair. I am presenting from Myanjin, and I want to start by paying my respects to the Yagara and the Turrbal people of the land. Now, on to the first question. if we were to talk about the complex relationship between cultural representation that is often expected of elite athletes which come from culturally linguistically diverse backgrounds, the first thing we need to understand is what the term CALD really means. Now, it might surprise some of you that the Australian Bureau of Statistics hasn't got any hard-written definition of what CALD means. So the whole essence and definition of identifying a group of people who come from CALD background is really grounded on the foundations of self-identification and a sense of belonging. So one really has to feel belonged into a certain community through their experiences. And it's particularly important for sporting athletes because a lot of what they do in the field sort of gives them an added identity into who they are already. And so one of the trends that we have been observing of late through the research is that there is an added burden and pressure on people in general who come from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, especially sporting athletes, to become role models within the society. The slide that I've got in front of you has got a list of challenges that have been identified by the Australian Sports Commission, which focuses on what are the important factors or what are the things that are limiting diverse communities from engaging in increased sport participation. And in several reports, including the Elevate 2042 legacy planning report that has been very recently published, and those sort of initiatives are ongoing. The understanding is that greater representation leads to people being inspired and sport participation sort of increasing as a natural after effect of that. Today's presentation is really about me trying to think about how we can shift the focus and change the dynamic of these understood, preconceived social equations. So to specifically answer the question about how cultural representation can become a burden is that when we celebrate a particular figure or a sporting figure from a culturally and linguistically diverse background, we often forget taking into account what are the difficulties they may have experienced in their sporting careers, what have been the obstacles, and only highlight on the medals and the accolades and the sort of celebratory aspects of their sporting experience. So shifting needs to happen in taking into account cultural safety, because if model figures with whom we are expected to be inspired from are to play an important role in increasing sport participation, then we must also understand what their difficulties have been for us as ordinary people who are not engaged in sport to be inspired into taking up active leisure and sporting activities in our daily lives. So I think if we think of shifting the focus and changing the dynamic, taking into account cultural safety along with cultural representation. Thank you.
Thank you. My next question for you. There is a growing interest in thinking about identity politics and intersectionality within the fabric of elite sport. Do you think that the Australian sporting culture understands these complex ideas well enough despite the growing interest?
Thank you for your question. Yes, so I think we have been hearing about intersectionality quite densely in the previous presentations, and I've particularly enjoyed Georgia and the last presentation as well. And I think when we think about how intersectionality can be centered in thinking through policies or making real changes in the world, there has to be an understanding of what is identity, intersecting identities as opposed to intersectionality. So intersectionality, drawing from Kimberly Crenshaw's work, refers to the ways in which different aspects of a person's identity can expose them to overlapping forms of discrimination and marginalization. Intersecting identities may not always do that. So a person with multiple different kinds of experiences may be privileged in certain situations and may be disprivileged in other situations. There is a real amount of power play, lack of privilege and overprivilege in societal hierarchy, operation that is at play when we think of intersectionality. So connecting this to representation of athletes from CALD communities, Julia Simmons, along with a whole lot of other athletes within Australia like Mahak Daw and Thorn Maker, who are young Sudanese Australian athletes, have often spoken about how they have felt that the burden of performing their cultural identity has taken away from their uh, skills or the particular sports that they're playing. So again, it is we want to be careful how we want to present intersectionality in the and in relation to what the experiences of these athletes are. So I think uh, identity politics can show us the ways in which privilege, be it gendered, racialized, classed, in terms of migrational experience, plays an important role in understanding how an elite athlete becomes a model within the Australian sporting consciousness. But within that understanding, there has to be room for taking into account the difficult experiences, the experiences that are not spoken about. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very interesting stuff. So how do you think the burden of inspiring plays out amongst elite athletes from CALD backgrounds? And what do you think the complex effects of this, or what do you think are the complex effects of this social pressure?
So thinking about the upcoming 2032 Olympics that we are going to host, within that context, I'd say that mega sport events and their legacy planning initiatives have gained, sustained interest over, the last decade in relation to how they can be effective in bringing up a whole range of societal changes. So economic benefits, politics and culture, health, sport infrastructure, sport participation. But one aspect that often gets overlooked is the affective dimensions of implementing these legacy planning initiatives that would affect the community most significantly eventually. And inspiration as an experience, as how we, as a community, we are supposed to magically feel inspired by hosting a mega event or by participating or by as spectators watching our role models performing there, is going to translate into increased sports participation is a very complex and sort of flawed assumption that a lot of the planning initiatives operate on. So as far as the focus on inspiration is sort of justified by its commonality in texts in describing the legacies of megasport events and the cultural associations between athletic performance and the almost untouchable status of elite athletes. Now, we as a community, especially the CALD communities, are sort of encouraged but also expected to be inspired by megasport events. It then becomes incumbent upon us as communities to be inspired just by looking at them, but it also creates an insurmountable amount of pressure on sporting athletes with intersecting identities to always be something inspirational in their sporting lives, both in the field and outside. And we often don't think about how the politicization of this sort of representation in media sort of creates very difficult, complex situations for sporting athletes, but also doesn't resonate with the communities at which these inspirational sort of projects are targeted at. So, for example, when in light of the recent successful of the women's football team, Sam Kerr's heritage as an Indian athlete was quite celebrated, and it was heavily published, and that was sort of presented as how that her figure as a woman who has Indian heritage was going to sort of resonate with the Indian migrant community. Now, a a series of assumptions that often people forget in these making these sort of equations is that Sam Kerr is not a first generation migrant. She was born, she grew up in Australia. So she's as much as an Australian athlete as much as she has got an Indian heritage. So these complexities of identities doesn't translate into suddenly, sort of the media or the sort of sporting community discovering that, okay, she has this heritage, and how can that be used to translate into increased sport participation? I don't think, and as research has shown, these sort of transactions get emotionally translated into increased sport participation. So understanding sort of the difference between how inspiration works at grassroots communities and how that can be thought through in policies and development of programs that really inspire people who come from marginalized backgrounds at various intersections.
We got it. Excellent.
Sorry?
Thank you.
Yeah. So there's a disconnect between how we are looking at creating inspirational figures of sporting athletes from the CALD community and how that is translating into the grassroots community.
Yes. So how do we, like all the issues that you have touched on today, how do we address them or tackle them in a real world situation through the lens of policy development?
Yes. So I think here I've got 4 points that could be used as a starting point through which we could rethink and shift the focus and change the dynamic of how we are thinking about reflecting some of these complex transactions through policies, looking ahead, but also looking differently while we look ahead. So taking into account cultural safety and cultural inclusivity in relation to complex experiences when we think about cultural representation. Representation matters, but representation in its complexity matters. Second, increased sport participation at what cost? Who are the people we are targeting when we are thinking about increased sport participation, and what are we doing in relation to thinking about intersectionality or gendered representation to make the increased sport participation a sustainable process as opposed to just an immediate after effect of a mega sport event. Reflexive thinking often is in many ways speaking back to how I talked about looking differently, in the sense that are we taking into account the difficult experiences? And finally, responsibility as a multiplicity, and this might sound a bit complex, but I take time to break it down as briefly as possible, is the responsibility for the athletes to represent to us as inspirational elite athletes to inspiration to as inspirational figures is not should not be turned into a burdensome experience for them. At the same time, if we think about the executive stakeholders within the sporting consciousness, such as planners, government bodies, and other sort of key organizational bodies that contribute to policy making, they must take into account what translates into increased participation emotionally rather than just in terms of quantitatively, and how that can be made sustainable. So responsibility is not incumbent only upon the spectators and the athletes. It's shared between all stakeholders who are involved in mega sport events. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, in your work, you examine the politics of shifting focus and changing the dynamics quite extensive. Could you conclude by speaking about these ideas briefly?
Yes. So I think to summarize, through our research, we have found that centering the 6 points that I have sort of mentioned here, experience as opposed to visual representation or sort of conventional representation, affect and emotional understanding of the complex experience, centering discomfort, awkwardness, difficulties that elite athletes from CALD backgrounds experience, intersectionality and how privilege and underprivilege works, disprivilege works in complex ways in different circumstances. Visibility, hypervisibility, and also invisibility. So often CALD communities do feel like the way in which they are used as representational models and elite sporting figures who are supposed to increase sports participation, they feel hypervisible in those areas, whereas they would like to be able to speak about their experience as sort of experience playing the sport, and that often gets under under examined in relation to their identity performance. And finally, negotiated belonging. So we all want to belong in sport, both athletes, elite athletes, and those of us who are a part of general community. But this belonging comes at a negotiated practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'll stop sharing my screen.
Stop sharing. I thank you very much.